The room held a silence so profound it seemed to stretch into eternity, as she stepped inside, her orders reverberating through her mind. Nira had been trained for missions of high stakes, but there was something about this assignment that struck deeper, that seemed to tug at some dormant nerve she hadn't known was there. She was the best spy the Scifi had to offer, the one they trusted for missions that required not just skill, but a presence that would draw even the most suspicious in. And here she was with orders to find and capture a human known only as Wolf, a shadowed name spoken in whispers within their most classified circles. Nira wasn't told why Wolf was such a high-value target, nor did she know exactly what threat he posed to her people. Only that he was a phantom, a man so skilled at evasion that he'd slipped through the hands of Scifi and human forces alike countless times. Wolf's legend was full of mysteries, tales of evading death, escaping impossible situations, and possessing knowledge that seemed far beyond what any ordinary human could achieve. But her assignment was clear. She was to track him, learn his secrets, discover his weaknesses. If possible, she was to bring him in alive. If not, she had clearance to end the threat herself. Disguised as a human, Nira adopted a new identity, an unassuming yet alluring one crafted to slip seamlessly into the human world. Her mission was shrouded in secrecy even from other operatives. As she moved through human society, her senses remained on high alert, her mind constantly analyzing every glance, every whispered conversation. She knew Wolf was somewhere in the vast city, but he was proving to be an elusive target, his presence as intangible as smoke. The first few weeks tested her patience. Every night was spent in shadowy corners, listening to whispers, tracing leads that often went nowhere. She haunted the bars and alleyways, the dimly lit streets where rumors about him ran thick, but concrete evidence was always just out of reach. Occasionally she'd catch wind of a sighting, a brief moment when Wolf had appeared before vanishing as quickly as he came. It was maddening, yet she felt the thrill of the chase. One evening her instincts told her something was different. As she slipped into a crowded underground club, her gaze swept over the dimly lit room. The usual crowd was there, restless and unpredictable. But then she saw him. A figure taller than most, with an air of calm confidence that seemed to ripple around him like a silent warning. He moved to the bar without sparing a glance for anyone, but even in the shadows his presence commanded attention. She observed him carefully, feeling a strange sense of exhilaration as her heart raced. She'd been waiting for this moment, yet she couldn't deny the nerves that prickled along her skin. There was something about him that felt different, more dangerous and unpredictable than any other target she'd faced. He was lean but strong, his movements precise, as if every gesture was calculated to perfection. And then his gaze shifted, his eyes locking onto hers with a sharpness that left her breathless. She felt a flicker of panic, but managed to hold her composure as he approached, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice smooth but edged with a hint of amusement. A faint smile crossed her lips, masking the tension simmering within her. "By all means," she replied, motioning to the seat across from her. She'd been trained to play these games of deception, to control her every expression, and yet there was something unnerving about his gaze, the way he seemed to look right through her. For the next hour they exchanged words that felt like chess moves, each probing the other for information, yet revealing little. Wolf was unlike anyone she'd ever encountered. His words were measured, his gaze never faltering, as if he were constantly assessing, calculating. She was supposed to be the one in control, the predator lying in wait. But tonight she felt the lines begin to blur. As they spoke, she began to sense layers in him that she hadn't anticipated. He was cautious, never revealing more than he needed to, and yet there was something in his tone, something in the way he occasionally glanced away that hinted at a man who carried more than secrets. He seemed haunted in a way that was both compelling and mysterious, as if he were hiding from something far greater than she could understand. By the end of the night, she found herself reluctant to leave him, to let this encounter end. She knew he was her target, knew that she was supposed to see him as nothing more than a mission. But something about him lingered in her mind, even as she slipped back into the night, her thoughts swirling with questions and intrigue. Wolf had become more than just an assignment. He was a puzzle, one that she found herself inexplicably drawn to solve. Days blurred into nights as Nira found herself drawn deeper into Wolf's world. What had begun as a mission of calculated precision was slipping into something far more chaotic, something more personal. They had fallen into an unspoken partnership bound by necessity, and a cautious trust neither fully understood nor acknowledged. In the dim shadows of the city they moved together, navigating the web of alleys and hideaways, a silent understanding forming between them. Wolf had an uncanny ability to predict her moves as if he were one step ahead at every turn, and she found herself both frustrated and intrigued by his constant awareness. They spent night after night in the underbelly of the city. Wolf moved with the ease of someone who belonged there, who had come to know every street corner and hidden door as if he'd carved his existence out of the very darkness. Neera's presence was less familiar, and yet she felt an odd sense of belonging by his side, as if this strange alliance had bridged the gap between their worlds. They spoke little, their words careful guarded, but with each silence shared in narrow alleys or dim-lit safe houses, she felt the distance between them narrow just a fraction. One night, after a close encounter with a gang that had been trailing Wolf for weeks, they took refuge in his safe house, an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts. The building was hollowed out, its walls scarred from past encounters, its floors coated in dust and the remnants of old battles. They leaned against opposite walls, catching their breath in silence. Wolf's dark gaze shifted toward her every so often, unreadable yet somehow understanding. She couldn't shake the sense that he knew more than he let on, that he saw through her carefully crafted facade. "You don't seem the type to rely on others," she said. Breaking the silence, her voice calm yet curious, her eyes lingering on his as she observed him. He let out a faint smirk, shaking his head slightly. "I don't," he replied, his tone a mix of caution and honesty. "Trust is complicated." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Then why let me in?" Wolf's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing, as if he were assessing her in that moment, weighing her every word. "Maybe I see something familiar," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his words carrying a weight she hadn't anticipated. The admission hung between them, raw and unspoken, bridging a connection she hadn't expected. Neera felt a strange stirring, something she hadn't experienced before, something that made her question her loyalty, her purpose. She was here to capture him, to bring him in, and yet as she watched the quiet strength in his gaze, the vulnerability he rarely allowed to surface, she felt her resolve wavering. He was no longer just a mission, no longer just a target. There was something in him that called to her, that whispered to her own buried secrets, her own hidden fears. As they sat in silence, Wolf's hand brushed against his shoulder, where an old scar was faintly visible beneath his collar. Her curiosity piqued, she tilted her head. "Battle wound?" He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You could say that." He left it at that, his voice clipped, guarded, but she sensed a deeper story, a history she wasn't meant to know. She wanted to press, to understand, but she held back, sensing that pushing him too far might shatter the fragile trust between them. Instead, she settled for silence, watching him as he let his guard down just for a moment, his gaze distant, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. "You don't give much away," she murmured, breaking the silence, her tone soft but probing. Wolf's eyes flickered toward her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Neither do you," he countered, his voice low and steady. "Guess that makes us even." Neera felt a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. She had spent years mastering the art of deception, crafting her every movement, every glance with calculated precision. Yet here was a man who seemed to see through her every mask, who refused to be manipulated or charmed. And in a strange way that only made her respect him more. He was dangerous, unpredictable, yet he was the first to make her feel seen, not as a Sciolari operative but as something more. As the night wore on, they settled into a quiet rhythm, a fragile balance that felt as if it could break at any moment. She found herself watching him, studying the way his gaze shifted, the way his movements were always measured, as if he were prepared to bolt at any sign of danger. There was a part of him that intrigued her, that made her question the mission, made her question her own intentions. She knew she couldn't afford to let her guard down, couldn't afford to let her feelings cloud her judgment. And yet the longer she spent with Wolf, the more she felt her resolve slipping, her sense of duty blurring with something she couldn't quite name. She wanted to believe she was still in control, that she could pull away at any moment. But as she sat beside him in the dim light of the warehouse, feeling the weight of his gaze on her, she realized she was more entangled than she had ever intended. Just before dawn, Wolf turned to her, his gaze lingering, his voice low and hesitant. "If things were different, if you were just another person," he began, his words trailing off, his tone softer than she'd ever heard. She looked at him, her heart pounding, her voice barely above a whisper. "What would you say then?" He didn't answer, but she saw it in his eyes, a flicker of something raw and unguarded. It was a look that spoke of regrets, of missed chances, of a bond that could never be spoken aloud. She felt a pang of longing, a yearning that was both strange and frightening. She wasn't supposed to feel this way, wasn't supposed to let her guard down. But in that moment, as they sat together in the silence of the abandoned warehouse, She couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if the mission didn't exist, if they could just be two people, bound not by duty, but by choice. As dawn broke, casting a soft glow over the city, Nira realized that she had crossed a line she could never return from. Wolf had become more than a target, more than a mission. He was the one person who had made her question everything she thought she knew. And as she looked at him, as she saw the faint vulnerability in his eyes, she knew that her world had changed forever. The night was dark and heavy, the sky cloaked in shadows as they made their way to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Wolf had chosen this place carefully, ensuring there would be no one to interfere, no one to witness the confrontation that lay ahead. Nira's orders had grown urgent, her superiors demanding she complete her mission, but she found herself unable to betray the man who had become more than just a target. Inside the warehouse, the air was tense, electric as they faced each other, the truth hanging between them like a blade. Wolf had pieced together the clues, had connected the dots, and now his gaze was filled with betrayal, with the pain of a man who had been deceived by someone he'd dared to trust. "You're one of them," he said, his voice low and cold, a raw edge of pain laced within his words. "A Scifi spy sent to capture me." Nira felt her pulse quicken, but she held her gaze steady, meeting his accusation head-on. She could see the hurt, the anger in his eyes, and it stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had betrayed him, deceived him, and yet standing before him now, she felt stripped bare, as if her every motive, her every secret lay exposed. "Wolf, I never meant... It wasn't supposed to be like this." She managed, her voice soft but firm, trying to convey the depth of her regret. His gaze hardened, his jaw clenched as he took a step back, his posture tense, guarded. "Then what was it supposed to be, Nira?" He demanded, his voice thick with bitterness. "Just another mission, another target, another person to manipulate?" She shook her head, the weight of her deception pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. "At first, yes, but things changed, Wolf. You changed everything." Her words were laced with desperation, with a raw honesty she hadn't intended to reveal. She hadn't meant to fall for him, hadn't meant to let her guard down. But here she was, standing before him, vulnerable and exposed, her heart laid bare for the first time in her life. Wolf's gaze flickered with a mix of anger and something else, something she couldn't quite read. "So you played me, is that it?" He challenged, his tone sharp. "You let me trust you. Let me think we were in this together just to bring me in." "No," she protested, her voice breaking as she stepped toward him, reaching out. "I was sent to capture you, but somewhere along the way, I realized I couldn't. You became more than just a mission." For a long moment he stared at her, his eyes locked onto hers with a raw intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She could see the conflict in his gaze, the battle between trust and betrayal, between anger and something deeper. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, his tone softened but filled with hurt. "Why, Nira? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" She took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of her words, the ache in her chest growing unbearable. "Because I didn't want to lose you. You became more than just a target, Wolf. You became everything." Her voice was thick with emotion, her heart pounding in her chest as she revealed the truth she'd kept buried for so long. They stood in silence, the weight of her confession hanging heavy between them. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the way his emotions flickered across his face. His jaw clenched as he fought to keep control. She wanted to reach out to him to close the distance between them, but she held back, unsure if he'd push her away. He had every right to hate her, to walk away and leave her standing there with her regrets. Finally, he took a step closer, his gaze softening, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can trust you, but I know I can't leave you either." Nira felt a surge of relief, her heart soaring as she met his gaze, her own eyes brimming with tears. She knew she didn't deserve his forgiveness, knew that her actions had caused him pain, but in that moment she saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to start anew, to rebuild the trust she'd shattered. She took his hand, her fingers trembling as she held on to him, anchoring herself in his warmth. "What now?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. She looked up at him, her heart pounding, her voice steady as she replied, "We run together." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw a vulnerability in him, a softness that he rarely showed. They turned toward the exit, their steps in sync as they prepared to leave behind the world of deception and betrayal. As they stepped into the night, Nira felt a sense of freedom she'd never known, a weight lifted from her shoulders as she left her old life behind. They moved through the city under the cover of darkness, navigating the hidden alleys and back streets, avoiding the eyes of those who sought to stop them. Nira knew the risks, knew that they'd be hunted, that her own people would come for them. but she no longer cared. She was no longer the spy, the Silari operative bound by duty. She was simply Nira, a woman who had found something worth fighting for. As dawn broke, casting a soft glow over the city, they found themselves on the outskirts of town, far from the familiar shadows they'd once called home. They stood together on a hill overlooking the sprawling landscape, the city stretching out before them like a memory. Wolf took her hand, his grip steady, his gaze filled with a quiet determination. She knew their journey was only beginning, that they'd face challenges far greater than any they'd encountered before. But as she looked into his eyes, she felt a sense of peace, a certainty that they'd find their way. They were no longer bound by duty or loyalty, or the expectations of their worlds. They were simply two souls bound by a shared past and an uncertain future. And as they turned away from the city, walking into the unknown together, Nira felt a sense of purpose, a drive she'd never known before. She had finally found something worth fighting for, something worth risking everything for, and she knew with Wolf by her side she'd face whatever lay ahead.